Monopoly, a game that has captivated generations in spite of its ruthless gameplay. The true purpose of Monopoly's creation has largely been forgotten, along with its original creator. Today, we're going to uncover the real story of Monopoly and a powerful message that still resonates today. The origins of Monopoly, as it was told for decades, takes us back to the 1930s, the height of the Great Depression. The hero of our story is Charles Darrow, an unemployed salesman struggling to make ends meet. One night, he was struck by inspiration and developed an idea for a board game based on buying and selling properties, what he would call Monopoly. He began selling the game at a department store in Philadelphia. It became something of a local hit, which led to interest from the game's publisher, Parker Brothers. They purchased the rights from Darrow, making him the first millionaire game designer. A true rags to riches story, but that's not the whole story. Elizabeth Maggie, known to her friends as Lizzie, was unlike most women at the turn of the 20th century. She supported herself, working as a stenographer and a secretary over the years, and wasn't married until the age of 44. She liked to spend her free time writing poetry, performing in live comedy shows, and fiddling with an idea for a board game. Elizabeth, as most Americans did in the early 1900s, lived under the thumb of powerful monopolists like J.P. Morgan, Andrew Carnegie, and John D. Rockefeller. Rockefeller is perhaps the most famous of the bunch and is synonymous with the word monopoly. He founded the Standard Oil Company in Ohio in 1870. To his credit, he was a master of operations. Through various innovations in only a few short years, he was able to reduce the price of oil products by almost 80%, making them widely available to even the average American. But Rockefeller didn't fight fair. His goal was to consolidate and organize oil and railroad interests into a cartel under Standard Oil. In just a few short months of the founding of Standard Oil, he had purchased 22 of his 26 competitors in Cleveland, what later became known as the Cleveland Massacre. This was, of course, just the beginning. This playbook ran its course all over the country, with Standard Oil eventually coming to dominate the entire industry. At its peak, Rockefeller's empire was responsible for refining 90% of global oil. Rockefeller's business practices didn't go unnoticed by the press or the general public. His ruthlessness, among others, gave steam to the antitrust movement in the late 1880s. The Sherman Antitrust Act quickly followed in 1890, effectively making monopolies illegal. But the fight was far from over, and this was the political climate Elizabeth Maggie was steeped in. Her father, James Maggie, was the owner of the Macomb Journal, an Illinois-based newspaper in the 1860s. He was an outspoken advocate of Abraham Lincoln and even traveled with him around Illinois as he held public debates with his political rivals. James Maggie was deeply disappointed in the politics and rising inequality of the time period. He was inspired to write his book. The philosophy of the book was heavily inspired by the economist Henry George. George believed that the poor and working class suffered because the economic system was specifically designed to enrich wealthy landowners. Without a doubt, her father's politics rubbed off on Elizabeth. Henry George's progressive economic philosophy and the injustices she witnessed around her were clear inspiration for her board game about buying and selling properties. She would patent it in 1904 under the name The Landlord's Game. Her hope was to teach people about the inevitable outcome of the economic system at the time. In Elizabeth's own words from the original rules, the landlord's game is based on present prevailing business methods. This the players can prove for themselves. And they can also prove what must be the logical outcome of such a system, that the land monopolist has absolute control of the situation. But she also designed the game with an optional single tax rule. This rule would see part of the rents paid to landowners entering into the public treasury. When enough money was in the treasury, it would be spent to turn certain spaces into public utilities, universities, and more. Any future player landing on those spaces weren't required to pay rent. There were still winners and losers, but at the end of the game, in Maggie's words, prosperity was achieved. But of course, this optional tax rule is not present in the Monopoly we know today. When Charles Darrow stumbled upon the game at a dinner party in the 1930s, he liked it so much that he renamed it Monopoly and started selling it as his own. He even sold the rights, which again weren't his to sell, to Parker Brothers in 1935. It was an instant hit, and Parker Brothers could not keep up with the demand. Word got back to Elizabeth that a game identical to hers was making its way onto store shelves across the country. She was able to prove that Monopoly was a blatant ripoff of the landlord's game. Parker Brothers purchased the original patent from Lizzie for the sum of $500, about $10,000 in today's money. Meanwhile, as the game's popularity grew, Darrow found himself a millionaire. Eventually, Parker Brothers and its big moneymaker Monopoly were acquired by Hasbro in 1991. Things only grew from there. Hasbro licensed the game to hell and back again. Over 300 versions of Monopoly now exist, including Pokemon, Star Wars, and even One Direction. The game is the best-selling board game of all time outside of checkers and chess. Lizzie would be distraught over what her landlord's game has become. What began as a protest to the vile business practices of the uber-rich became a tool to line the pockets of one of the largest corporations in the world. The lessons Elizabeth hoped to teach are as relevant as ever, with massive companies like Google and Amazon bringing this conversation to the front of our collective consciousness once again.